Yes. Okay. Uh, yes, it is recording. Very good. Hi, I'm Marge Johnson, the founder and director of Northeastern Illinois University's Business Innovation and Growth Center. And most of our work is featuring, working to help startup entrepreneurs launch their businesses. And I'm really thrilled today to be able to interview and introduce you to Lauren Washington. Lauren is an entrepreneur herself. She's the founder of the Black Women Talk Tech organization. She is also the founder of Fundr, F-U-N-D-R, which is an angel investor platform. And she is quite an amazing woman. I first became aware of Lauren when she was the keynote speaker for the DeSpont Symposium on entrepreneurship with MIT University. And she did an amazing job as the keynote speaker, and I did a brave thing. I reached out to her in LinkedIn and said, hey, would you please do an interview for our newsletter? And she very graciously agreed. So Lauren Washington, we're very happy to have you here today and to have you in our newsletter. Thank you so much for taking the time. When you were the keynote speaker, you talked about your education background and how that led you, how that helped to prepare you for your entrepreneurial path. And so if you wouldn't mind telling us a little bit about your time at University of North Carolina and then also at Northwestern's Kellogg School of Business.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for having me here. I'm really excited to share my story with all of your readers. So I started the undergrad experience going in, not really knowing what I wanted to major in necessarily, but knowing that eventually at some point in my life, I wanted to be an entrepreneur. So that was always the end goal for me. And so when I was looking through all these different places to have my degree, I really honed in on the School of Journalism and Mass Communication. And the reason I did that was for a few reasons. I think having writing skills is incredibly important throughout your career. And as I get older, I realize how important those writing skills are, and being able to tell a story, being able to express yourself through words in a way that makes sense for a corporation and not just personally. And then also my actual specialization there was graphic design. And I chose graphic design because I felt like I could have something to fall back on, if anything. If everything didn't work out, I could always fall back on graphic design. And that is another thing that has carried with me throughout my entire career. So I still do all the graphics and branding and work for all of my companies. And it's something that I didn't realize how important that skill was. So having those two things has really given me a jump start in terms of my career. And then after I left undergrad, I went into Teach for America. So I was a teacher for a year, and then I went to InStyle magazine and TV Guide magazine. And while I was there, I realized that even though I had these great skills, the graphic artist, I didn't have the business language in order to push those ideas forward. I always felt like I was sort of catching up in terms of what my story was and how to express my ideas in a way that made sense for businesses and were really heard. And so I really wanted to go back to business school in order to sort of get those skill sets and understand how the business world worked overall. So I went back to Northwestern. I got a degree in entrepreneurship, finance, and marketing. And it really laid the groundwork for me to understand how businesses are started, how they scale, and how they sustain over time. And so after I came out of business school, I went into the agency world for advertising for a few years and then started my first business, which was Keep Up.
So quite an unusual path, because a lot of people don't get a formal education in order to become an entrepreneur. And I'm a lot older than you were. When I went to Kellogg, they didn't even have a program in entrepreneurship. That's what the losers did, was start a business. And yet I jumped off and became one of those losers to become an entrepreneur. So one thing that you said really struck me, though. You said that you always knew you wanted to be an entrepreneur. And that's one of the, as I tell all of our students, I say that the one thing that every entrepreneur has in common with all other entrepreneurs, and that all the non-entrepreneurs do not have. And I always wonder what that is. And I say they decided to become an entrepreneur.
Mhm.
So until you make that decision, you're in the non-entrepreneurship category. And yet a lot of times college degrees and stuff prepare you for non-entrepreneurial life. The career track is to go and interview for a major corporate job or something like that, or to interview for a public service job of some sort, but not to become an entrepreneur. And one of the things that research has shown that entrepreneurs have in common, besides the decision to become an entrepreneur, is also having a role model in their life that was an entrepreneur. Was that true for you?
Yes, absolutely. So I come from a family of entrepreneurs. My mom was a teacher for a long time and then opened up her own business. She had one of two spas on Staten Island at the time. My dad was a firefighter and then also had a side business in construction. And then they both owned real estate and were landlords as well. And so I always saw them owning things. And then my larger family as well always had either their own businesses or side businesses as well. So I understood what ownership looked like very early. And when I was 11, I actually wanted to start my own business. And so I knew no matter what industry I went into, I was really interested in magazines and fashion and all the things that probably typical young women are interested in. And the end goal in those careers was always go into corporate, learn a little bit, and then start your own business and own it and build something on your own. And so being able to have that role model is so important, especially for young Black girls who don't see themselves necessarily as these leaders. And it's not even just them, it's the whole industry, right? So if you ask someone, what does a tech leader look like? You're going to get Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, Bill Gates. You're not going to get a Black woman. I can't imagine most people can name a Black woman tech leader. And so having someone who you can look up to, who you can say, I could be like that at some point, opens up a world of opportunity. And I was lucky enough to have that when I was young.
And that's kind of what led you to found Black Women Talk Tech, is that you were creating a forum by which people could have specific, not just entrepreneurial role models, but entrepreneurial role models that are Black women in tech, right? Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think that that was our initial mission, was to create role models. I think we ended up doing it. But I will say selfishly, it was more to help us as entrepreneurs get the resources and support that we lacked within the industry. And so I was working on my first business, Keep Up, and my two co-founders were also working on their businesses. And we just found that we struggled with the traditional advice that was given to tech founders because it just didn't work for us, right? Just, oh, go raise $1 million from your friends and family. That was just not even possible. And it's for a lot of Black women. And so we wanted to talk about those struggles and those specific experiences that we had. And we felt like if we came together as a collective of founders, we could share what we've learned all together with each other. And it sort of exploded from there. And I do think one of the missions, part of our mission is to promote Black women so that we can change that narrative overall, so that a tech founder doesn't necessarily have to look like a white man. It could look like a Black woman or any other type of person, and make it seem like these people are leaders and can create successful businesses. And that helps everyone down the line.
And you have a big annual conference that you run also as part of that. And what year, how many years have you been doing that now?
So we just did our 4th year, and we have 1,500 people come out to that conference this year in February.
Congratulations. And thank goodness you got it done in February.
I got it done right under the wire, yes.
Yeah, very good. You know, Kauffman Foundation does a lot of research about entrepreneurship. And in particular, as I've been researching, I was struck by how few underrepresented populations are in the entrepreneurship field. Kaufman research shows that only 1% of African Americans start businesses, and only about 2 to 3% of people of Hispanic descent start businesses. And unfortunately, women are also extremely underrepresented. Depending on the year, maybe 10% of new starts up to as high as 17% of new starts. So it's a problem that has existed for a long time. And I'm wondering, what do you think might be some of the blocks of why underrepresented populations don't start businesses?
Yeah, I think that's a big question. I think there's a couple of different areas. One is definitely funding, especially if you're talking about tech or scalable businesses. We are completely underfunded. There's a huge gap in terms of who gets investment in order to build their businesses out. So for Black women in particular, they on average raise $36,000 for their businesses when the average failed white male-led organization raises $1.3 million. And so when you are going up against something like that, it's really tough for you to build your company when I have $36,000 and you have $1.3 million, right? You're already starting at a disadvantage. I think the other piece is the community, right? And the wealth. So what we find is that a lot of entrepreneurs we have this narrative that they are self-made, but most entrepreneurs actually have a financial safety net of some sort. They either come from money or they have family who has money. They have saved money from being in their career and building up a lot of wealth that way. And when you look at underrepresented communities, the wealth gap is so large that it makes it very difficult for you to sort of take that leap and take that risk. The risk is different, right? If you know that you have a few $1,000,000 from yourself or your family to fall back on if you fail, it's very different than if you don't have that kind of wealth or don't have a safety net and you still have to take care of family and children and spouses. And so I think we see that a lot in terms of our entrepreneurs, that they're not necessarily ready to take that deep dive fully into their businesses because they know they don't have that financial safety net to help keep them afloat. And for example, a lot of Black women put their businesses on their credit cards. That's where they're actually funding their companies. And so they're going into debt instead of using equity and using other people's money that's essentially free money for them to build their businesses up. And I think the other thing is that, again, it's the narrative of who can be an entrepreneur. And so going into this world, if you don't necessarily have other people to talk to about this or who can guide you and tell you how to do that, it's very difficult to get started and to sustain. That's one of the big reasons why we started Black Women Talk Tech, because even though there's a lot of people who start, actually having them sustain their businesses for years over time gets very difficult when you don't have someone who's done it before. So when you're looking to people in your community and you're looking for role models who have done this or people who can advise or mentor you to bring you to that next stage or get you through an issue, it's very difficult to find that when there's only about 30 or 40 Black women who've raised $1 million ever within the tech industry, right? So those 30 or 40 women are having to really mentor every Black woman who's interested in a business. And that's sort of impossible. And I think that's true for women as well. So understanding that there are networks that we are not necessarily a part of that are able to sort of pull people up and help and guide and give them that support and structure to build their businesses that does not necessarily exist in other communities is definitely a factor as well.
Yeah, and it's not just for Black women. I did my first friends and family raise, and that collectively brought up $1,000. And that was my mother and my brother and my uncle scraping together what money they had, right? And I'm like, okay, well, thank goodness I have a job. I went and lined up as much credit card debt as I could before I quit my job. And I had therefore 1 year's worth of salary that I could draw on the credit cards. And I drew it all and was still barely breaking even, And my biggest competitor by the time I sold, he was a white male who had gone out. He was, exactly the background you outlined. And I had been in the business first and kind of created the industry. But when he came into it, he did a private equity raise and brought in, hundreds of millions of dollars to be able to launch as my competitor. We sold within 2 months of each other, and each of us individually walked away with the same amount of cash. I
Wow.
owned 85% of my business. He had less than 10% of his. And he was in, 10 cities across the US. I was only in Chicago and New York. And he and I are still friendly, right? I learned a lot from him and he learned a lot from me, but you're right. The path is so different if you don't have that wealth cushion in the first place, and if you don't have the access to capital, which leads me to your current venture. Your others are also your current ventures, right? But the Fundr, Fundr, that you have started. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And that just came from not only my own personal experience with my first business, Keep Up, and our struggle to raise money. We had won the 43 North competition back in 2014 and won $250,000. We beat out 7,000 applicants to win that pitch competition. And it felt like that should have been a signal to the investment community that we were worth investing in, but we struggled for over a year to pull in additional money in order to keep our business going. And unfortunately had to end up closing that business. And after I started Black Women Talk Tech, I heard that story over and over and over again, and your story over and over again. And I realized that it wasn't just me. And I think when you have that light bulb moment of, actually, it's not me. There's a systemic issue here in terms of who gets funding and the process that it takes to get to those funding stages needs to be shifted and needs to be changed. And we haven't had any actual disruption in the investor community in decades. Which I find really funny and ironic because they love to disrupt other industries, right? And so they haven't done it for themselves. And I have a number of theories as to why. But I do think that it's time for that shift and it's time for that change. And our product is not necessarily removing the investor. We're not saying that your opinion is not important and you don't need to evaluate these companies, but we are saying there is a better way to do it. You can automate certain pieces of it, and you can also use that automation in order to create less bias. You can make your investment process move a lot faster. And you can also discover new startups that you may have passed over otherwise because you're looking through this lens of trying to fit a startup founder in the exact same molds. And this will pull out people who sort of look different and have different ideas. So it sort of brings a arbitrage situation essentially to seed investing. And so it automates everything from the evaluation and due diligence process. We have 90 questions at the startup, takes everything from team to market, traction, and personality test even. And then we automate the overall signing of the documents and term sheets. That is all completely automated. And then also the relationship after, so that you can really build and grow with your investors through monthly reporting and chat rooms.
And it's an education process as well, right? So that rather than just stumbling along, you've built all the processes in, so oh, okay, I've got to do this next step. How can somebody who has a great idea, not me, in tech, somebody who has a great idea, how can they get involved in Fundr? Just go to your website or?
Yeah, just go to our website. It's fundr.ai. We have a wait list there where you can sign up as both a startup and an investor. So we're taking accredited investors as well as institutional investors as well on the platform. And we will be launching our beta very soon. We have a large list right now and we'll be launching with them in the next few weeks.
Oh, okay. I'm very excited to see how that progresses. But thank you for all that you're doing. In particular, the government, the federal government, is also realizing that they need to do things to spur entrepreneurship in this country. Obama, in the Jobs Act that he had, came up with something I wish had been around when I started my first business, where he expanded. It used to be the SEC would only allow you to bring in a maximum of 35 investors as an S corp or something like that. And Obama expanded that, allows now for crowdfunding. And I just thought that that was the most amazing thing when I saw it come out. And nobody seems to know it or take advantage of it. I know in particular that you are kind of an expert in this area. Could you tell us a little bit about how you think that that should help accelerate entrepreneurship?
Yeah, I definitely think the Jobs Act was a great first step in terms of bringing democracy to the investing process. So the other side of Fundr that we try to help with is the fact that getting into angel investing is very difficult. You not only need to have the same kind of networks in order to get into certain deals, but there's a huge learning curve in terms of being able to look at these startups and evaluate them and know how to understand the risk reward scenario of investing. And I think a lot of people get into seed investing and lose their money because they're not necessarily doing the work beforehand to understand how to invest. But there are about 14 million angel investors in the US alone, and only 3% are actually investing. And so when you think about that ability to spread the wealth out, when you have these billion-dollar IPOs that people are making millions and billions of dollars out, but it's being concentrated into that 3% who is able to get in very early stage in terms of these companies, that's not really sharing out the wealth and looking at that long term, that does not have great implications, I think, for the economy. And so I think that's what the Job Act was trying to do, was to expand that a little bit more into crowdfunding. Unfortunately, I think there are a couple issues with it. I think the first is that crowdfunding still has the same barriers to investing. You still have to go through and read hundreds, if not thousands, of different startups and evaluate them and choose the ones that you're interested in. You still have to know how to do the due diligence. You still have to understand how it fits into your overall investment portfolio. So there's still all those issues there. And then the other thing is that it comes with a lot of barriers and regulations for the companies themselves. And so Fundr specifically is working with accredited investors because the way that these laws work is that everything sort of looks like a copycat site. So I don't know if you've ever seen gone to a couple different equity crowdfunding sites that all look the same because they have to look the same. They have to hit certain types of regulations. And unfortunately, that doesn't leave a lot of room for innovation within that industry. And so I do think it's a great first step. I know that there's a lot of conversations in terms of expanding that and loosening some of these regulations, which is really exciting. But I think there's still a lot of work to go in order to make sure that the average everyday person has the opportunity to create wealth in these investment classes in the same way that some others have in the past few decades.
Yeah, so I love all the work that you're doing, Lauren, and it is very sophisticated and yet also opening the doors of access, right? So you do have to do your homework. You do need to get up to speed on the things that you would invest in, all of that. But I agree with you. It's an excellent first step, and I'm looking for more and more people like you opening up these doors. It's part of how we can eventually close some of the wealth gap. So it's not just entrepreneurship, right? But people need to realize that if you want to build generation after generation wealth, that path in America has been you start a company and then the next generation, and it's not really significant wealth until you hit, the third or fourth generation of owning a business. I know you have a very hard stop here. I wonder if you have one last word of advice for us before you've got to get off this call. And thank you again so much for doing the call. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I think that my last word of advice is, even though we've talked a little bit about the struggles and we've talked about some of the barriers that are towards entrepreneurship for certain communities, I would not let that stop you in terms of starting a business, because like you mentioned, it is historically and continues to be the ultimate path towards building wealth. Most people who have wealth in this country and are in the top 10 to 1% of the wealth bracket have done it through entrepreneurship. And so understanding that it is high risk and high reward, it is going to be hard, and your journey might be a little bit harder because you're a woman, because you're Black, because you are an underrepresented minority. It may be a little bit more difficult, but that doesn't mean it's not worthwhile, because we have to sort of start pushing through these barriers and breaking them so that we can create that wealth for everyone else and for and democratize it. So I would say it's worth it. Do it. Put yourself out there. Try. Find us at Black Women Talk Tech. We have Black Men Talk Tech as well for support organizations, and there's a ton of peer founder support organizations, and you work with them to figure out how to build your business if that's something you're interested in doing.
Thank you so much, Lauren. I really appreciate you doing this, and I love all the work that you're doing. So you have a new fan.
Thank you so much.
And hopefully many more fans as well. Thank you. Have a great day.
You too. Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.